Good evening. My name is Tibor Benjamin Szabó, Publishing Director of HGG Books Publishers, and it is an honor and a daunting privilege to introduce tonight's event. First of all, a statement. Have faith. We are all bold enough even to hold a book launch event during the Champions League final period. No courage is like that. So, thank you all for being here tonight to celebrate the launch of a book that explores something we all admire, occasionally avoid, and usually promise ourselves we will start doing from Monday: courage. It is a real pleasure to welcome the author and to have the opportunity to hear directly from someone who asks a deceptively simple question. Not who is bold, but how we become bold. This book reminds us that courage is not reserved for explorers, superheroes, or people who answer emails immediately, which means exactly the same as superhero. No, it lives in everyday decisions, speaking up, trying something new, changing direction, and sometimes simply taking the first step. What makes this conversation especially exciting is that Dr. Gulati approaches courage not as mythology, but as something understandable, practical, and learnable. Hence, Dr. Gulati's contribution tonight is not only about a book launch, it is also an invitation to think differently about fear, possibility, and maybe to leave this room just a little bolder than when we arrived. So, we have delighted to welcome the distinguished author of our new book, Ranjay Gulati. He earned a master's degree in management from the MIT Sloan School of Management in 1987, and he received his PhD from Harvard University in organizational behavior in 1993. It is also a pleasure to welcome László Radványi. He is an economist who joined to PwC Hungary in 2003 after obtaining his master's degree. Currently, László Radványi is the Chief Executive Officer of the company. It is also an honor to welcome Tamás Sauer as our moderator for tonight. Mr. Sauer studied at City University of London and Cass Business School and obtained his master's degree at Imperial College London. Currently, he is the CEO of HGG Publishing Ltd, and previously he worked for global companies such as Santander Bank, Deloitte, Bloomberg, and ING Bank. First, we will listen to Ranjay Gulati's keynote speech about the nature of courage, and after which Tamás Sauer, László Radványi, and Ranjay Gulati will discuss the most important insights from the book. And at the end, you can also have your copy of the book signed at the signing session. So, with no further ado, please welcome Ranjay Gulati.
Well, good evening, everybody. Come on, good evening. Just want to make sure you're awake, you know. It's a pleasure to be here to talk to you about my research. And since I see some students here, some different mix of people. Yesterday I spoke to just business leaders, so today my talk is a little different. So let me just kind of dig into this. I'm a professor. I teach at Harvard Business School. I'm a researcher first. And so this book was actually never meant to be written. It was not my area of research. I don't study this stuff. It was when I have binders for my research projects, and this binder was labeled hobby project. And periodically, you know, my student or somebody would ask me, what is a hobby project? And I said, a hobby project you don't have to publish. It's just something I do for fun. And so 12 years ago, I started looking at, you know, just interesting leadership stories. What do leaders do? I had research assistants collecting stories. Their job was just go story hunting. And each story was 50, 60 pages long. I would make them really, once I liked a story, I would make them really study it carefully. I would do interviews sometimes. So this thing kind of emerged out of really opportunistic study. I did do one paper that kind of touched on this theme of courage and boldness. And it was a paper in 2010. At that time, I was interested in what do companies do in down markets. Wait a minute, is there a clock here? Somewhere. Let me just grab my phone, because otherwise I'll keep going for hours. I'm a professor, you know, I like to talk. And if I don't know what time it is, okay. So this paper was based on what do companies do in down markets. Because when you talk to people in business and ask them, when is the best time to get ahead of competition? Is it up markets or down markets? It's actually, they'll tell you down markets. But when you observe their behavior in down markets, everybody's busy cutting costs. So nobody's investing in down markets. So they say it's a good time, but they don't do anything. So I thought, okay, let me get data. I got data going back 3 recessions in the US, all public companies. And I looked at what do companies do in down markets. And I found that the vast majority of companies cut costs. That's it. Survival. They're in survival mode. A small number of companies actually invest for growth in down markets. Vast majority are in survival mode. The ones that invest for growth come out of the recession much stronger. And that's why the article was called Roaring Out of Recessions. What was also surprising to me was the number of companies investing for growth was like 9%. So a very small number of companies. Now, I didn't even use the word courage or bold in this 2010 article. I never analyzed who these 9% were. I didn't look at their CEO or their leadership team or anything. I just said, you know, hey, if you want to grow your business, invest in down markets, and you will come out stronger. So, and then I have an MBA class I developed called Business Transformation and Turnaround. And some of these stories are quite remarkable. Lego. So I have Jörn Vignustrup, who turned around Lego. When he became CEO of Lego, 20 odd years ago, Lego was almost bankrupt. And he had to find a way to really revive Lego to what it is back again today. So then Levi Strauss, also nearly bankrupt, and Chip Bergh took over. Unilever still struggling. Some of them are not fully recovered. Netflix never really was in a crisis, but they had to change their model multiple times. So when I have most of these classes, I will bring the CEO to class. And after the CEO leaves, I would ask the students, what did you think of that CEO? What do you think of that leader? And they would use words like fearless, courageous, audacious, heroic, gutsy, transformational. So I was kind of getting this idea that there is something about courage in leadership. But we don't use that word in business. We talk about authentic leadership, we talk about transformational leadership, we talk about, visionary leadership, but we don't really use the word courage. It's just something we use in war, military, and even the word is kind of misunderstood. So I really decided to get into this. I collected 200 plus stories. I mean, from extreme left, there's a historical story from 150 years ago. Harriet Tubman, she was a slave woman who escaped from slavery somehow from the South, came to the North, and then decided to do something crazy. She went back to rescue and bring back other slaves with her and started what became known as the Underground Railroad. At one point, one of the most wanted people in America, they hired bounty hunters to go find her and kill her if they could. But she still kept doing it. So I found her memoirs to understand, now why would you do that? Or some closer to home, not far from here, that was Alexei Navalny, right? Why would he go back to Russia? He's miraculously got away, came to Germany, recovered from this poisoning, And he knows the Russians have said very clearly, you come back, we'll arrest you. And sure enough, he goes back, they send him to Siberia, he dies. So I looked at all his writings and his speaking. I didn't get to interview him, but the others I did. I also looked at sports coaches. This guy is in college football, the most winning coach in college football history. And he turned around like 4 teams. How did he do that? That's Anne Mulcahy, former CEO of Xerox. When she became CEO of Xerox, the media, Wall Street Journal interviewed Jack Welch, who was CEO of GE, and said, what do you think are her chances of success? And Jack Welch said, even Jesus Christ can't save Xerox. And she turned it around. I also, by the way, since we have the Champions Trophy Cup over here, I also interviewed Sir Alex Ferguson, multiple times to understand how do you be a winning coach. So, and then I had to look as a researcher. I hope if you read my book, please read the footnotes. There's 400 of them. It took me a long time to write those footnotes. And I hope somebody will read them because everything was researched. This was not like I have some stories and some blah, blah, blah to tell you, I was going to try to ground my findings in social science research. I am a research professor. So everything, but the problem for me was this wasn't one body. There's no courage research. It's in psychology, it's in sociology, it's in economics, it's in neuroscience. This was really what I would loosely call integrative scholarship. I had to really piece together to understand and build what I hope is a coherent body of understanding of courage as a concept. Anyway, I wrote the book. I have a draft. I submit it to the publisher. And the publisher tells me we need a personal story. And I don't have a personal story to tell. And they said, no, Ranjay, you don't understand. Without a personal story, it doesn't come through. And you need to tell us why you wrote this book and what is it about you that makes it so interesting. I tried. I told them many stories. And basically my editor, who's friendly with me, basically very politely was saying the word lame. You know what lame translates to in Hungarian? This is not a real story, Ranjay. This is a very lame story. And I'm thinking, well, I'm a professor. I don't have I didn't go to war. I was not here or there. Anyway, so finally I remembered the story, which I was ashamed of. Honestly, I tried to forget the story. There's a reason why I couldn't remember it. I was 14 years old. My mother was quite an unusual person. She was doing a master's in anthropology with Vanderbilt University in the US. It was a summer program that met every summer in Athens, Greece, for school teachers. And the American school where she taught had sponsored and sent her. So for 6 summers, she was coming every summer to Athens. And her master's thesis was about tribal Indian women who hand-printed their own fabric. That idea, then she would buy these fabrics from these village women in India and get skirts and blouses made for herself. And pretty soon her classmates were saying, I want that. So she started a little side business where she was buying these fabrics and selling them to her friends in Athens, but also at the American school. In 1972, she has a crazy idea. She goes to Paris with 2 suitcases. Long story short, convinces 3 fashion houses to buy her designs. This thing takes off. She's got she's several thousand people working for her directly, indirectly, very quickly. So at this point, she decides she's going to buy a piece of land and build her dream home. And my friend coming in Hanachi has heard this story yesterday night, so he has to hear it again. So she's bought this land, and a developer really wants the land. And in India, I don't know if you know, property rights are a little loose. So the developer's harassing her for the land, and she doesn't want to sell. But anyway, she's home, I'm home for the weekend, and from boarding school, and she has a guard at the gate. He comes to me and says, there's somebody at the gate insisting on seeing your mom. Can you talk to him? I go to the gate, it's the developer, and I say, look, she's not going to see you, and you're wasting your time. He said, tell her 5 minutes, and I'll never bother her again. So I go inside, I say, he's saying 5 minutes and never again. So she said, okay, bring him in, you stand at the door. Your job, 5 minutes to take him away. I said, okay, no problem. I'm 14, I figured I could do that. So I bring him in, he comes in very respectful, polite, immediately takes out a blank signed check and a sale agreement document and says, ma'am, I'm not here to negotiate. I need your land. please, you write the amount on the check. It's yours, but I need that land. My mother says, look, with due respect, I don't care about money. It's irrelevant to me. I've been looking and looking. This is the ideal location for me. I've already designed my house on that land. It's already done. I've got the plans approved. I'm not selling. So thank you, but no thank you. Immediately, this gentleman, who was very polite, suddenly gets loud. I am not leaving here till you sign this paper. So my mother is like, I'm shocked. She's shocked. She says, please leave now. Then he's wearing a blazer, and he leans back and pulls his blazer back, and he has a gun tucked in his waist. Now, I'm at the door. I don't know what to do. I'm confused. I'm frozen. I'm paralyzed. Maybe I was scared. I don't remember exactly. I'm just thinking, should I go to the guard? Should I call the cook in the kitchen? Should I jump on him? Maybe why provoke him? Maybe it's a fake gun. Maybe it's not loaded. Let's see what he does. Let me get some more information. I don't know. Let me just see. I'm just paralyzed. My mother, who was 5 feet 1 inches tall, immediately jumps out of her sofa seat across from him, walks around the table, comes in front of him, and slaps him across the face. And says, how? And I can tell you from personal experience, that must have hurt. Her slaps were hard. And she says, how dare you come into my house? First you try to bully me, and now you try to threaten me. Get out of here now. Now, this was a strategically very smart move, because the noise she made got the guard's attention at the gate. He came running in. Her cook came running in. This guy is now outnumbered. He rattled, and he runs out of there. So after he leaves, I said to my mom, I said, you're crazy. Didn't you see he had a gun? She said, yes. I said, weren't you scared? She said, yes. And then she said something to me that I will not forget. She said, just because you're scared doesn't mean you do nothing. Just because you're scared doesn't mean you do nothing. Now, honestly, I was ashamed of myself in this story, because by the time you're 14, growing up in India, you're kind of feeling protective. I'm a man, not a boy. And I did nothing. I just stood there. But it was maybe in the back of my mind, somewhere I had this thought. Why do some people jump into action and others don't? And this is true in business as it is in life, right? You're going to see many situations where some people are very proactive, right? And are kind of have a can-do mindset. They get stuff done. And others are passive, reactive, and don't do much. So this was always on my mind. You know, I have doctoral students, and some of them are highly proactive. They want to get their research done. Others are just spinning their wheels. I might do this, I might do that, I might think this, I might think that. You know, how do you get people? And some people are bold in their thinking. They want to try ambitious ideas. Others want to be incremental. So how do we do that? So I'm going to show you a short video, because honestly, I didn't even know what courage is. And watching Hollywood movies had me very confused. What courage is. So I'm going to show you a short clip, not from a movie, but it's actually Tom Cruise doing his own stunt. This is considered one of the most difficult stunts ever, or dangerous stunts ever. Not in the latest Mission Impossible, the previous one. And you'll see what I'm trying to convey, because these kinds of things, this kind of narrative and imagery really had me confused about what is courage. And then we'll get to how do we become courageous.
3, 2, 1, action! I saw a canopy. To you guys, thank you.
Now, John, that was absolutely beautiful. Like, nothing wrong. Bike went away. I mean, the track was perfect. It was great.
Thanks, mate. I think I can hold to the bike a little longer.
pretty much the biggest stunt in cinema history. Tom Cruise just rode a motorcycle off a cliff 6 times today.
So when I showed this video to my MBA students a few weeks ago, one of their reaction was, well, what a waste of motorcycles, you know? You can see where their brain is going. But you know, this kind of imagery confuses us because it creates an image in our mind, at least my mind, that courage is the absence of fear, right? James Bond, you know, when did you see James Bond saying, I'm scared? In fact, there's a lot of fear shaming, especially for boys, by the way. Gender bias over here. If a young boy tells their parent, I'm scared, what is the father's response? What do you mean? Be a man, come on. I'm guilty of that myself, so I know what I'm talking about here, right? So fear shaming. We don't want to even acknowledge fear. And if you don't name it, you can't tame it. So we don't really understand, and then we think of it as a personality trait. Either you have it or you don't. Pretty much every single individual I studied weren't born courageous. They became courageous. Mahatma Gandhi is an extreme example of that. He was terrified of public speaking. He became a lawyer in London early in his career. In his first court appearance, he froze. He couldn't speak. The judge actually threw him out of court and made his client go find another lawyer. Clearly, this guy learned how to speak eventually. So you discover most of these people were not necessarily born courageous. Somehow they learned courage. How did they do it? Is there social science to explain that behavior? And can we then learn from that? That was the project. That how do we do these things? And by the way, most of courage is, I have plenty of physical courage. This was also physical courage. I've told you a physical courage story. They are nice storytelling. But there is moral courage. There's intellectual courage. One of my stories is an MBA student of mine who became a whistleblower at Facebook. She blew up her career. Harvard MBA, dream job, blows up her career to really whistleblow on Facebook. But she felt she had to do it. So I looked at not just physical courage. And all of it revolves around this emotion of fear. Fear is a primal human emotion, and even he says, it's not that I don't get scared, it's that I don't mind being scared. Or my mother saying, just because you're scared doesn't mean you do nothing. Right? But my larger opening question was, are we born courageous or can we train for courage? Let me ask you all a question. How many of you have, at some point in your life, been scared to do something, but somehow found a way to do it anyhow? Raise your hand. How many of you have, at some point in your life, been scared about something? There we are. All of us have done it. The question is, can we replicate it, codify it, understand it, and say, aha, I know what I need to do. I know what I need to do to make it happen. So, and I, by design, looked at not famous people. This guy is a young man, mild-mannered, soft-spoken, slightly built, lives in Southern California. He's the third-generation owner of a ballroom dance hall. His grandmother started it, his mother ran it, and then after they both passed away, he has been running it. And by his own admission, he never ever got into a fight because whenever there was a fight, he ran away. In fact, he and a friend of his joked around one time saying, what would you do if you saw a man with a gun? And they both agreed they would either hide or run. Well, one evening, he's working at the cashier's desk at the dance hall, and a gentleman walks in with an AK-47. And this guy tells me, when I interviewed him, he said, my first reaction was to close the cashier door and hide under the table. Then he said, I don't know what happened to me. Next thing I know is, I've opened the cashier door, I'm out in the hallway, I'm in a full-blown fist fight with this guy. And somewhere in the fight, I managed to pull his gun away from him. What Brandon didn't know is this guy had just come from another dance hall where he had killed 20 people and shot up and wounded another 25. And there were 40 people in this dance hall today, and he was going to shoot them all. So Brandon says, I don't know why I did it. It was an impulsive decision. So I said, well, help me understand, what do you think led to that? Because it's so out of your character. And he's thinking, and said, you know, maybe I think about it. I'm the third generation custodian of this dance hall. He didn't say owner. He said, I'm the custodian of this dance hall. And I'm thinking, you know, my mother and grandmother up there, wherever they are, if they were to look down and see I'm hiding under the table while there is somebody shooting up the place, I don't think they'd be happy. He felt this kind of moral imperative. He had to do something. Even he didn't understand it. So I'm trying to say, okay, what can we learn from this story? And I will talk about that later. Frances Haugen, you know, my former MBA student, hard-charging MBA, takes, in this case, not impulsive. That was an in-the-moment decision. She took 1 year. She spent 1 year agonizing, should I, shouldn't I, talk to her parents, talk to a lawyer, talk to a journalist, she talked to a priest. She was really trying, and by the way, she built a support network. She didn't do it alone. She had this whole team behind her. It was a support squad, and we'll talk about that. So in her case, it was not done alone. It was done with a collective behind her. Alexei Navalny, you know, why did he do it, and what did he do? I'm going to talk about this guy, a pilot whose engines, a commercial airline pilot, and both the engines shut down when he takes off from New York LaGuardia Airport. And he's 3,000 feet off the ground, and he has to make a decision in the moment. What do we do? And then, of course, there was my mother. So I'm going to talk about all these characters and what they did and how they did it. So I'm going to touch on 3 different facets of courage. There's individual courage, how we talk ourselves into courage. How do I think my way into courage or act my way into courage? There's relational courage, how I use others to resource myself to find courage, the way Frances Haugen did, and so did so many others. And then there's collective courage. How do I get teams or even my organization to think of courage? So, you know, we have our friend Lachi here from, PwC. How does he get his PwC organization to become more courageous in how they operate in the face of AI? But also, how does he then do that for his clients? As he's helping them develop strategies for growth and adapt in these kind of turbulent markets, how does he help them build a bold strategy? Because organizations by design are risk averse. Common theme across all of this is taking on fear, which is everywhere. We have congenital fear. I'm born fear, scared of some things. Then we have conditioned fear. I was bitten by a dog and now I'm scared of dogs. Or I watched that movie Jaws and I'm scared to go in the water. Blah, 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 right? And then there's cognitive fear. I think my way into fear. But, the problem we think and how the human brain is wired. So fear is a primal human emotion. It's a survival emotion hardwired in the primitive brain, in the amygdala. It's what our ancestors used to run and hide when there was danger. Right? So the typical human response is not fight or flight. It's freeze or flight. My response, I froze. Right? Others' response is flight, run. You heard that from Brandon say. Occasionally fight. Fight is the last resort. If I have no other option, I'll fight. That's what I was doing. I'm thinking, okay, if this guy really goes for his gun, then maybe I will jump on him. Right? Honestly, I hate to disappoint you, but we are all descendants of cowards. Our ancestors are the ones who ran for cover. If you think you are a descendant of brave stock, I'm sorry to disappoint you. We are all kind of descendants of cowards, right? So how do you think about fear? I lucked out in that a professor at Harvard is the world expert on the emotion of fear. So when I interviewed her, she said, Ranjay, to understand fear, you got to understand the point of origin of fear. What activates fear? So it's a primal survival emotion, but what is the trigger point for fear? The trigger point for fear is uncertainty. Uncertainty is not the same as risk, by the way. Risk you can manage, model, that's modern finance, is all about risk management, right? Uncertainties, I don't know. Can any of you tell me when the Iran war is going to end? Do you know? Tomorrow? Day after? Next week? When will oil come back to normal pricing? Come on, anybody know? What will the global tariff regime look like? When will Ukraine war end? Come on, nobody knows? That's uncertainty, right? Or think about the early days of COVID. Remember those early weeks? We don't know. So uncertainty triggers in our mind a loss of control. Loss of control and uncertainty together is what activates fear. Now, human beings, we have lived with uncertainty for thousands of years. How did we deal with uncertainty for thousands of years? The most common response for thousands of years was to pray to a higher power. That's how we learn. You look back to the most ancient of cave drawings, and you will see people praying to a higher power. So that was one way to deal with it. Another way my students like to tell me is human beings invented alcohol. That was another way to deal with uncertainty and fear, but I don't know about that one, right? But then there were some people who were able to act in spite of fear. That's courage. So courage was somehow being able to deal with this kind of fear response that is so common. Now, HBR, Harvard Business Review, did a cover story on the book when it came out, and the editor had the following to say. The editor wrote, "We are immersed in an uncertainty crisis that demands a degree of courage we have not yet built." It's no surprise in a recent study of earnings calls by CEOs in the US, right? They have to do an earnings call every quarter to explain their earnings. The word uncertainty was used 3 times more this year than before in the previous several years. Everyone's talking about uncertainty. It's not just geopolitical uncertainty, it's technological uncertainty, it's environmental uncertainty, it's health uncertainty, it's economic uncertainty. There's so many forms of uncertainty. And living where you are right now, there's also a lot of uncertainty. I mean, things have really changed in the last few months for all of you, but there's uncertainty, like what's the future going to look like? So in the face of uncertainty, there's naturally a lot of fear. So the argument, not just I make in my article, but the HBR editor makes, is that, courage is the currency for survival and success in the world, not just in business, but also for all of us as we imagine our careers. What's my career going to look like? So what enables people and organizations to behave with the courage? That became the question. Once I understood that courage is learned, then the question was, how do you resource yourself to act with courage? And I started to then look at stories in much more detail to understand how did these individuals resource themselves to do things. I wanted to build a theory of behavior. I wanted to create, in the book I talk about 9 C's. Everything starts with a C. I've just learned that, and unfortunately in the translation into Hungarian, we couldn't do all C's, so the C's are gone, but that's okay. I tried to be cute. I thought it was a little cute, but whatever. Okay? So I'm going to talk about the C's in English. So, here's interesting. This guy, I go to Levi's to give a talk in 2011, and this company is already in trouble. People are not buying denim jeans anymore. These guys are making denim pants for men. And men are buying khakis and cotton pants and athleisure pants. And furthermore, for every pair of pants, a man has 3 shirts. And they're not doing shirts. And they're not doing women's clothes. And furthermore, the channel through which they sell is mostly Sears going bankrupt, JCPenney also in trouble, Walmart making their own brand of jeans and squeezing their margins. They're focused on middle-aged men, not even younger. So women, no. Younger, no. Tops, no. And by the way, they have $2 billion in debt. And I meet this guy, people are complacent, they're relaxed because they have such a strong brand. It's a cool place to work. And I said, why did this guy take the job? What are you doing here? He's a successful guy at P&G, he's CEO of Gillette, he's done an amazing job. By coincidence, he sat on the board of VF, which owns Lee and Wrangler, the competitor to Levi's. So he knows the denim business really well. And when I meet him, I ask him, why did you take this job? And he explains it in kind of really interesting terms. He said, I felt I had to. It wasn't a rational decision, it was an emotional decision. And I'm still not understanding, what do you mean emotional decision? Why were you morally compelled to take a job? What is it about a job that makes you suddenly feel it's personal to you? But I realized at that moment, and he did an amazing job, by the way. Fixed the stores, direct to consumer, women, younger, culture, purpose. I realized fear is a reaction, courage is a decision. Some people just make a decision that I am going to do it, right? And how do they do it becomes the question mark for us. So here is another story, and this one I hope I will use to illustrate several of the C's. This guy, it's an in-the-moment story, so it's not over time. Normal, beautiful day, it's winter, January in New York, so it's cold, but it's a sunny day, no wind, nothing, 1-hour flight, easy flight. He takes off at 3:24. As a pilot myself, I can tell you, worst thing that can happen to you is engine failure soon after takeoff. They hit geese, both engines down. They try to turn the engines back on with the ignition, doesn't come back on. They call control tower. Tower says, turn back and land back in LaGuardia. They say, sorry, we can't do it. Don't have enough height. They say, go straight and land in New Jersey across the river. They say, sorry, we don't have enough height. We're over Manhattan. 30 seconds later, they make a decision to land the plane on the Hudson River. Now, no commercial pilot has ever landed a commercial plane on water safely, ever. There was one previous attempt, and the plane flipped, and most people died. So and now this guy has to do it, and he does it. So I'm not going to show you the interview, but let me tell you a few things he does that help me illustrate a few of the chapters in the book. The first thing he explains is that he had to stay calm. There's a whole chapter on the science of calm. He says that, I had to summon from within me this professional calm that really isn't calm at all. It's the discipline to compartmentalize and focus on the task of hand in spite of the stress. Without the calm mind, I couldn't have pulled it off. Well, there's a body of research called emotional self-regulation. The idea of dialing down an emotional response to a very difficult situation. So there are many strategies to doing this. He relies on one of the strategies, which is checklisting. When you make a checklist, what are you doing? You're tuning out everything else and just doing the list. You're tuning out everything else. Pilots are trained to do that. Surgeons are trained to do that. Professional athletes are trained to do that. Do not look at the scoreboard. Play the play. 1, 2, 3, 4. I've had 3 double faults. It's okay. I'm going to serve again. And what do I do in my serve? 1, 2, 3, 4. Bang. Get out there and do it. Right? I'm a golfer. Tiger Woods had this. Tiger Woods in 2022 Masters, he's playing a hole number 12 is playing a par 3 hole. Par 3 is an easy hole, right? He gets a 10. He hits 2 balls into the water. A 10. Even I play better than that, okay?
It's what we all think.
Yes. What does he do after that? He birdies the next 5 holes. Completely tunes it out. Completely. I would have been a mess after that because that knocked him out of the tournament. So, how do these people have the discipline, the science of calm? And everyone, then that's one strategy, checklisting. Another one people use is rituals. I interviewed several commandos in the Ukrainian army on the front line. They talked about rituals they use to stay calm. One guy said, walking around your tank clockwise 3 times every morning. Or you make they have little religious symbols on their equipment and they touch it and put it on their head and kiss it. There are all kinds of rituals to calm yourself down. I talked to Katie Ledecky, the world famous Olympic athlete, who's won more Olympic gold medals than anybody ever will in women's swimming. When she goes to a meet and you're winning by 0.0 seconds, she recites her grandmother's name to calm herself down. Adele, the famous singer, looks at a picture of Celine Dion before she sings. So all these people have rituals, they have routines. Oh, by the way, the Marine, if you look at the Navy SEALs, they use a yoga breathing technique called box breathing to really reduce their blood pressure and calm down. So there was a whole chapter I have on calm, which is dialing down the fear response, first of all. Then another piece comes up, which is around the chapter which I call confidence. Now, I'm not a fan of the word confidence. I would have called it something else, but let me tell you what the study is. This one I'm going to start with the research behind it. There was a really famous study in the 1940s by 2 British psychologists. One of the first, I would say, empirical studies of courage. They embedded themselves in the most dangerous British Army units, which was bomb disposal and paratroopers. And they found that people joined these units, and for the first several weeks in training, they were terrified. But somehow, through the training, as they got more and more experience, they calmed down. Even though it's a high mortality group, but they somehow calmed down. Dealing with fear, coping systems. As you got more exposure, more training, you calm down. So this Stanford professor decides he wants to recreate that study, but there's no war going on. So he recruits college students who are terrified of snakes. The technical term is ophidiophobes. These are kids who can't even look at a picture of a snake. And he offers to pay them money that over several months he's going to show them pictures of snakes and then eventually show them a live snake, and eventually they will have to touch and maybe hold the snake. And this is a corn snake. They don't bite, but they are 6 feet long. They look scary. They look like a python. In the couple of months, more than half the students drop out. The pay is really good, but this is too much for them. But 10 students hang in there, and they complete the study. Not only do they hold the snake, they touch the snake, they do a fantastic job. So that was interesting. The research was interesting. He did it, but then what was interesting was what happened after. So a couple of months later, he invites those kids back into the lab just to see if they're doing okay. And they report that this study changed their life. They feel different about themselves. They feel they can do anything. They can take on anything. And that's why the research is called self-efficacy. The ability to deal with your fear of snake has turned into your ability to live with fear on anything. So you start to see the idea of self-efficacy, not the skill you have, but the belief you can do it. So this guy had never landed the plane on the water, but he was an experienced pilot that he said, I knew I could do it. I knew I could do it. Now look at that in people. There are many entrepreneurs, not all, but many entrepreneurs who have a can-do mindset. That's just the way they're wired. That's how they become entrepreneurs. No matter what curveball comes their way, they're like, I got it. And others are like, oh, no, that's too hard. I can't do it. This is wrong. That is wrong. I don't know how to do it. I'm sure the business leaders sitting here can tell you there's a handful of people who work for you, of all of them who have this can-do spirit. And most of us don't. So how do you build this self-efficacy? So that was the second one. The chapter is called confidence. The third one to me is interesting. And this one comes from a quote on what he says. He says, my entire life up to that moment had been a preparation to handle that moment. Right? Or Brandon Say said, I was a custodian. I had to do something. Right? Or the Chip Berg at Levi Strauss saying, I felt responsible, even though I'd never worked in this company, it's an iconic brand. I grew up wearing Levi's jeans. I had to do something. And I discovered courage is not the absence of fear. It's the decision that something matters more than fear. This chapter is called conviction. That is, if you build a conviction that something matters more to you than anything else, you have a conviction to do something. How many of you here, raise your hand if you had to do something for your family versus for yourself? How many would do more for your family than you would do for yourself? Raise your hand. So there we are. Right? So when we have conviction about something bigger, so we create meaning, we create a sense of identity around who am I and what am I supposed to do here, and together this create a sense of felt responsibility. I had to do something. I had to do something. And that conviction, now it can be manipulated, right? This is dangerous because in cults and other kind of social movements sometimes, leaders who can be devious can use people this way. But in team sports, it's interesting. Some of the top sports coaches try to get people, again, go back to Ted Lasso. What's he trying to do? Get you to believe in the team. You're not playing for yourself. You're playing for each other, and you're playing for the team, and you're playing for me. And when you do something for something bigger than yourself, you're going to do more. So that was conviction. I'll leave you with one or two last ones, then I'm going to wrap it up. This one is called connection. Most of the times when you see movies or read fictional stories, courage is viewed as a solo sport. You do it alone, right? The heroic leader, the whole narrative is about the individual, the heroic individual who did it. Most of the time, it's not alone. It's a team sport. Now they get support. I mentioned to you Frances Haugen. She did not do it alone. Her parents, the journalist, her lawyer, her priest, her friends, they all boosted her up. So this chapter on connection, I actually found some great research by a Wharton professor on how entrepreneurs, when they're taking risk and are terrified, how they find support from the investors and from others. And entrepreneurs look for 4 kinds of support that I think is helpful to all of us, actually. They look for instrumental support, meaning give me money, resources, or tools, education. They look for information support, give me valuable information. Where can I find a job? What kind of a job? How should I think about my career? We look for emotional support, more emotional and moral support. And we look for feedback support. The first two are easy to find. The second two are much harder to find. Building your support squad. Who can give you moral support? Who can tell you, you can do it? I know you can do it, right? Who's going to give you honest feedback and say, you know, I think you should modify and change your approach here. So this was this connection. I'll turn to the last one, which is collective courage. You know, how do we go from individual to collective courage becomes another challenge. I started by first looking at teams, right? I love sports. So I started by looking at teams. I'm just now going to start a case on the All Blacks, the New Zealand rugby team. But I really want to find a European soccer team to write about, but I've been struggling to get access. I looked at the Marine Corps and Special Ops. I looked at social activists, social movements, how they mobilize people. I mean, your country is another illustration of that. Because in the business context, at least, then I went to business organizations. Business organizations are hardwired for risk aversion. How do you build courage in an organization to try and experiment and fail and learn? In the context of AI today, yesterday, you know, PwC organized this great event on how AI is going to transform organizations and jobs and the world around us. It's terrifying. And companies are not sure what's going to happen. And they don't know how jobs are going to change. They don't know how their business model is going to change. They don't know how they're going to make money. They don't know how they're going to do anything. And some organizations are paralyzed. They're kind of waiting to see till I know more. And sometimes doing nothing is riskier than doing something and failing at it. Sometimes you have to act and take action in order to learn. So, you know, how do we create that capacity in organizations to act with courage? So if I want to bring this discussion together, I've talked about a lot with you. So let me repeat a few of the C's I talked about. The first one, anybody remember? What was it? No? Calm. Got that? The second one was confidence. Got that? The third one was conviction. Got that? The fourth one was connection. So that's the way kind of every one of them is a chapter on how do you resource yourself to become courageous. Right? These are actually, and each of them is grounded in a body of research that really helps us understand it. And also, so it's not just me making up stuff saying, come on, go try it. This guy tried it, or that person tried it. So let me try to bring the whole thing together. And then we want to have a panel discussion. Our lives are rife with uncertainty today. How many would agree that there is more uncertainty in the world around you today than there was 12 months ago? Raise your hands. There we are, right? Uncertainty triggers fear. It's okay to be scared. You have to name it in order to tame it. I used to be ashamed of fear. I've come to realize it's okay. If you're scared, just say, it's okay, I'm scared. That's normal. It's not abnormal. Courage is an abnormal response. Fear is the starting point, and now you've got to deal with fear. Fear triggers different responses, freeze, flight, or fight. And it's usually freeze or flight. Courage is leaping into action in the face of fear. If you were a literary audience here, how many of you read The Wizard of Oz? Come on, raise your hands. What did the lion ask for when he got to the wizard? What did he ask for? Courage. What did the wizard say to the lion? No, he said, you already have it. The lion said, but I was scared. And the wizard says, you were scared, but you still took action to protect your friends. That is courage. You already have it. So courage is taking action in the face of fear. We can learn courage. That's the central premise and the reason I decided. I told you, I was not going to write this book. This was a lot of work, much more work than I ever wanted to put into this project. But I had to write it. I felt compelled to write it once I knew that we can learn courage. And courage is the currency to succeed today. So I've been getting a lot of messages from people when you write these kind of books. I didn't realize about on LinkedIn and an email, or the two media that I use. I've been getting a lot of messages from people all over the world. This one was a haunting message. This person said, I have been living my life through fear, not my dreams. That fear has paralyzed my ability to do anything I ever wanted to do, really. And I came to, and the Dalai Lama says this in the foreword to the book. He says, courage is an inner journey to be taken one step at a time. So let me summarize for you and what my wish for all of you is. Do one small thing that scares you a little. Find something that scares you a little. This will boost your individual courage. Find ways to resource yourself through taking small steps and also building a support squad. This will enhance your relational courage. Ask your team, if you're part of a team or you're leading a team, what can we do to be more bold? How can we be more bold in the face of this uncertainty in which we're living right now today? So, in the end, my wish for everybody here is let's all find a way to be more bold in a world that is faced with uncertainty. And because I will suggest one last research study to you. In this study done by 2 Cornell professors, they looked at people who experienced regret. So they went to airports and found people who looked like they were retired and said, what do you regret most in life? And people, when they were describing their regrets in life, they had much more regret about inaction, things they didn't do, than action. So if we are going to live a life without regret, then I think we need to really build out our courage muscle. And it sometimes doesn't happen overnight, but it's done one step at a time. So I want to thank you really. This is my, you guys were quick in launching a non-English edition of my book. This normally takes a year, 2 years before other language editions come out. And the timing is uncanny that it comes out 1 month after you've had an election. So I am delighted to be here to share this research with all of you. So I want to thank my organizers, the hosts from PwC and from our publishers for hosting me here. So thank you very much.
I'll sit at the side.
Okay. I'm going to be attacked from 2 sides.
Exactly. So I think all of us feel much more motivated after your presentation, your talk than before. And speaking of doing something that takes some courage, I'm going to try to challenge you, which is a sort of courageous thing, considering that you are a renowned Harvard Business School professor, and of course Laszlo as well.
I love that, by the way.
It's.
And I'm not.
No. I was going to say that, of course, Laszlo as well as a seasoned CEO. So I think I will need some of that courage in order to talk to you. And before I put together these couple of questions, I consulted my expert assistant, ChatGPT. So I asked ChatGPT, okay, how can I be challenging but still respectful? And it said, the only thing that you should avoid is telling the professor that this is a self-help book. So I thought, okay, yeah, that's probably right. But then let's ask you to reason against it. So, what exactly is boldness? Is it really a scientific term? Can it be tested for or measured? What do you think?
So here's why the label self-help also is a negative connotation, but I have no problem with it. The problem with some of these self-help books is they're kind of opinion books. They're not based in any science or research. Everyone thinks they're a wise human being, and every one of us has a self-help book in us. So, I write my life story and I give my opinion. You should do this, get up in the morning and eat cornflakes, and then, go for a run. Look, let me tell you how brilliant my life is, and I think you should live life like my life. And so they get a bad rap for that reason. This is not that kind of book, because I told you the footnote should give you the answer to that. Did I go out?
That's the proof of science, the footnotes, right?
Not exactly. Because what is not here is it is not based on my going out and measuring a courage index and doing my own research beyond my study of organizations that act with courage. So it turns out there is actually others. That's why this is integrative scholarship. I wasn't relying only on my research. This is not a summary of just my research. It's other people's research as well. And there are people who've been trying to measure courage and created even a courage index to understand courageous action. So I document and talk about that in my studies as well. But in each chapter, I am relying on empirical research. I mentioned to you the chapter on confidence. That is entirely driven by Albert Bandura's research on self-efficacy, right? The chapter on support, which I call connection, the 4 forms of support, is entirely driven by the research by this guy Campbell, who was at Wharton. And he did lots of empirical studies on these 4 forms of support, right? Or the chapter on calm is entirely based on this body of research on self-regulation, emotional self-regulation. So each of my chapters is built around a body of research that is a long empirical tradition and uses that to help us understand the story or stories, and also then gives some advice as to what can we learn from these, the research and from the storytelling.
Okay, so now we know that there is a science to it, but going to a more practical field, like Laszlo, how would you say you measure the courage of your colleagues? Like, how do you test for this skill, competence, and how bold do you think Hungarian business leaders are in general?
Okay. First of all, hello everybody. I'm Laci Radványi. I'm CEO of PwC.
Yes, Tibor had an introduction.
Okay. I wasn't here. I wasn't here.
Yes, luckily our audience knows.
And probably CEOs are very courageous in Hungary because they are sitting down with a Harvard professor discussing something which he wrote a book about and I didn't. So that's number one. So I think making colleagues courageous, there's no such a process for that. I think it's more around the cultural story for me. So how you create a culture of safety, and people can grow with their own pace, and you can let them find their own way, how to be courageous. And and it's not for everybody, to be honest. It's more around how you make a community who can make both and good decisions together in a consultative way. Talking about Hungarian CEOs, and yesterday we had a CEO event, so it was interesting. You also managed to meet a couple of those. So if you're looking at from a data perspective, which we are very happy to do as PwC consultants, actually it doesn't look like we are very courageous CEO community. So when we compare ourselves with let's say CEE peers, Poland, Czech Republic, Baltic states, and courage you take as what's sort of how you measure, for example, bold business move, investing somewhere abroad. That's maybe number one. Investing cross-cultural, cross-industry. And if you have these data points and just compare those with other national peers, we are much more behind. Let me give you just one data point. So when we analyze the top 100 Hungarian companies with Hungarian shareholdings, and we compare with the Czech ones, the Polish ones, so actually, in terms of subsidiaries, Hungarian top 100 companies have half of the subsidiaries abroad, so outside of Hungary, than their peers in the region. And when it comes to like real existence, their real activities, the comparison is even worse. So it's like 1/3 have some sort of cross-territorial investment. When it comes to cross-industry investments, which is actually super important and becoming much more important when we are analyzing how we need to transform our businesses all around Hungary and make sure that we can somehow step up in value chain, somehow be able to make more value add, then you need to be able to integrate either vertically or horizontally even more. And this activity is very, very low in Hungary. And also, unfortunately, what we see, the pipeline of those transactions are also very low. So some sort of business boldness we definitely lack currently, making speeches together with Harvard professor, then when we look like in a very good position.
So let me kind of build off of that, actually. Because you see, the reason I said businesses are hardwired for caution is businesses are designed to be predictable and more consistent and accountable. So in our desire for accountability, consistency, predictability, short-term results focus, we create a system in which failure is not tolerated. When you don't tolerate failure, you stifle out the capacity for experimentation, right? You only undertake projects where you have made a full, solid business case with all the information available on hand, and then say, okay, now we'll do it. It's like Kodak, which, every idea for digital imaging put forward to Kodak was rejected. Kodak had the first prototype digital camera in the world. They had the most digital patents in the world. But they couldn't overcome this, it has to work for sure before we will do it. And so we don't have the capacity for experimentation, tolerance for failure, tolerance for learning. So you've already hardwired into an organization that, unless we know it's going to work, don't do it.
Just to maybe challenge that a bit. So I think not just organizations, but even organisms, going to the field of biology, it has this maybe phenomenon that you can only tolerate failure if you have the resources to allow for failure. So I think going back to maybe the Hungarian examples, maybe lower access to capital or talent or any kind of resource that you need in order to progress quickly or rapidly in business. If it's not ample, if there are not plenty resources, it's very hard to tolerate for failure. I can say this from personal experiences as well. Our company, HVG, after the 2008 financial crisis, became much more risk averse, probably for several years, because it almost collapsed under those years. So any kind of organism, let it be a company or a tree or anything that has cells in it, must heal its wounds first and have ample resources before it can allow for fear. It can allow for courageousness.
It's just Hungarian specific, if I may react earlier. So, and I think Hungary is a very, and to put it's not going to be that very unique business environment anymore, but now it is. And we just finished our CEO survey. You've been participating on some of our discussion on that, but just let me give another data point here around fear. So if in a normal business environment, you would fear of competition, not having available resources, skilled workforce, etc. When you're asking Hungarian CEOs what is their fear and biggest concern, and competition you can manage. Skilled workforce you can make collaboration with wonderful universities, you can do internal development. But the biggest fear in Hungary was from regulator. Regulation is not something you can manage, because there you need to be fully compliant. This is not something you can manage, no matter what resource, no matter what type of internal capability you grow, you need to comply. That's it.
But I want to also invoke, there's some Nobel Prize winning research in economics on loss avoidance. And the simple answer, for those who don't know Kahneman and Tversky's research, is that human brain experiences losses as more painful than the joys of winning. Also known as the fear of pain is greater than the joy from gain. It's just normal, right? Even in golf, I mentioned to you golf, a golfer experiences the pain of a bogey more than the joy of a birdie. Losses are just felt as more painful. So now if you imagine that scenario, then you're always going to say, oh, what is the downside risk? And you see people some people are naturally very downside loss focused. Others are more upside focused. And how do we, and I also, that's the first point I wanted to make. The second is, Aristotle made a very interesting distinction when he wrote about courage. He distinguished courageous from reckless. So courage is not the same as reckless. Reckless is where you take action without the consequences or thinking through the consequences. Courage is where you are intentional about it, you're thoughtful about it, you may bound it, you may say, okay, this is not like I'm gonna bet the whole farm, but we're gonna run pilots. Or even for yourself, individually, you might say, I'm gonna go to a new city and live in Paris for a few months. I'm not gonna just move there, I'm gonna go and live there for 3 months. And I'm gonna see what it's like. And if I think I can handle it, I will try to consider getting a job there. Or, so it's not, so you look for ways to tiptoe your way into it sometimes.
We have a really, really nice, and very couple of 10 plus years with us, real estate developer client, one of the biggest one in Hungary, very wealthy Hungarian person. And generation shift is always a big challenge for family businesses. And the guy from one day to another told to me that, okay, next year it's gonna be his son taking over. And I was fully surprised because he was in full control, he was really motivated, and I didn't understand. And I asked him, okay, Peter, what made you make this really challenging decision? And he said that, look, during the summer I realized that now for losing like 500,000 euros for me makes me more upset than winning 5 million euros. So I don't need to continue. Now it's time for my son, who is much happier to making 5 million than being afraid of losing 500,000. So.
Well, first of all, I'm really happy when it's not me reciting books that HVG published, Kahneman and Tversky's book, Thinking Fast and Slow.
Yes.
That's what you were referring to. But while I was reading your book, I had this thought that isn't there a survival bias in management theory for boldness or courage? So for every successful story that you put on the board, there are an infinite number of stories that we don't know about that fail. So when it comes to, for example, the example that you had at the beginning, investing during a crisis, of course, we only know about those stories that survived that crisis, not those that failed in the process. So, how can we reconcile the opposing forces of boldness and risk-taking? How can you, Laszlo, as a leader?
So, they say that there's kind of a graveyard for every Elon Musk, but for us, it's always around. It's being courageous is not about being reckless or completely blind. I think most of the people in the room know this traditional Hungarian joke with the horse dealer selling a horse and says that horse runs next to the wall, and then the buyer is completely upset and says that this horse is blind, and then the seller said no, it's just courageous. So it's I think this is really, really important. So when we are courageous, is about that we are making data-based decision after proper consultation, and not like fooling, not just jumping into some sort of uncertainty. I think, and referring to back, which is also one of my favorite books from Daniel Kahneman, HVG published book, that it's really, for us, what is really, really challenging is to subsequently make an independent judgment of the previous judgment we've ever made. We've always thought that how could we have made a better judgment? We've never assessed the process. We always criticize ourselves from a position when we obviously have much more knowledge about that time when we made that particular decision. So that's kind of how I see it.
Let me build off another body of research. This is another chapter in my book I didn't discuss with all of you, which is, this chapter is called Comprehension. And it's based off of research by a University of Michigan professor who actually sadly passed away this past week. And his name is Carl Weick. And Carl Weick's research was called sense-making in his body of work. And one of his early studies was of firefighters. And when firefighters go into a building, they don't know what's going on inside the building. They don't know how far the fire has progressed. They don't know if building is about to collapse. They don't know if somebody needs to be rescued. But they don't have the luxury of waiting to get all the information before they go in. They're not going to send a drone in or a little robot in and then say, okay, once I get the information, then I'm going in. No, they got it. They form hypotheses. They gather whatever they can see visually from outside, and they go into the building. As soon as they go in, they're gathering more data. They're gathering more data to revise their hypothesis. And they slowly work their way into the building. And what Carl Weick says, sometimes you don't know before you act. Sometimes you have to act in order to know. So you don't leap into the darkness. You're not running in. The firefighter's not running into the building. He's walking into the building, and he's gathering data, updating, iterating, revising. So it's a thoughtful, iterative process where you may not have all the data up front, but you're acting in order to know. And the more you get in there, and the example I use in the book is actually of Fukushima, the plant that did not have the meltdown, where the plant manager had to really, it was him and his team that prevented a meltdown in the second complex of Fukushima. And they had no idea what to do. There was no template. So think about it. You have a complex with 20-foot high walls. The tsunami brings water 55 feet high, completely submerges it. Nuclear reactors work on dashboards and panels. So in the control center, you have all these gauges, but none of them are working because everything is submerged underwater. All you know is that your cooling system is also shut down because power is gone, and the cooling system is needed for the reactor or there is a meltdown. And there's a ticking time bomb. You have, I think, 45, 50 hours to get the cooling back up. That's all you know. You don't know where there's power. You don't know where you're going to find it. You don't know where you're going to find the cables. You don't know. And how they do one step at a time to gather data, revise and understand what they might do, and taking it one step at a time, acting your way into knowing. So sometimes, courage is taking small steps into the unknown rather than big steps. In the world of AI today, I think some of the most savvy companies I see are doing exactly that. They're not waiting, but they're not leaping either. They're working their way in. Similarly for your careers. I mean, if you're thinking about how is AI going to affect me, people do experiments. They take a summer job. So all the kids I know in high school I talk to, I tell them, go work in the summer. Try things you might or might not want to do. Act your way into knowing.
So there was a saying that was going through my mind while I was listening to you, and it's also leading us to our next topic. And the saying goes, every corpse on Mount Everest was once an extremely motivated person. Which brings us to the topic of motivation, and another interesting story that I want to take your opinions on. So in the First World War, the French army had executed 600, the British army almost 400 men of their own for cowardice. Funny fact, I think, is that the German army executed not more than 25 people. And this mostly happened early on in the war, to set examples for soldiers not to freeze, the thing that you just mentioned, or leave their posts amid danger. So one can say that this was the incentive for soldiers to be more courageous. But how good do you think this system or motivation was for courage? How would you have done it? And what are modern day best practices? Are we still using incentives like this?
So I have a whole chapter on cowardice. And in my chapter on cowardice, I actually talk about a World War I incident, which I found in a history book. I told you, I'm looking everywhere to see what I can learn about courage. And I found it fascinating because this historian documents this anecdote about a particular soldier. I think it was in the British Army, where what's happening is his commander is frustrated because This guy is there in the front line. Whenever the bombs start flying, he runs away. Abandoned post. But then a few days later, he returns. You forget that in World War I, the number of people who abandoned and ran away and never came back was also very large. Right? They just ran away. So this guy kept coming back, and another soldier in the unit tells the commander, why don't you shoot him or report him? And the boss calls him the good coward. He says, he's a good guy. He really wants to fight. Look at him. He keeps coming back. He just is not able to deal with the fear in him. And all our job is to help him learn to accept and live with the fear. And I think slowly he will learn. And that's eventually what happens. So I told you, cowardice is the normal human response. Survival is the normal human response. And building a system to deal with fear is what we need to do. How do we resource others to deal with fear? So the argument you presented on this shooting people, so one argument is the very economic utilitarian argument. Make it painful.
These were facts. I was not
Oh
arguing.
yeah, no. But it's an
good or
economic
bad.
logic. It's an economic logic that make it so painful that if you don't operate the way with courage, we're going to shoot you. So what people actually call it, and I'll tell you what they call it in the Marine Corps. So I looked at the Marines when I wrote this case on the Marines. In the Marines, why are people in America willing to risk their lives in a faraway place, far from their boundary? You're not protecting your border. So in the Marines, they call it relative fear. You are so connected and bonded with your peers, the fear of letting your teammates down is greater than the fear of dying. So in the World War II, World War I, it was like the fear would be that if I'm going to get shot or I got to fight, so it's relative fear, except now in modern day it's replaced by peer pressure. That the shame I will have to live with of being labeled a coward is so great that I'd rather, the fear of dying is less. So how, some people rely on relative fear, which is the example you gave. But I think there are more positive, affirming ways to do it. How do we create the science of calm? How do we build confidence, right? How do we build connection, right? How do we build conviction? How do we build comprehension? All these then are ways to kind of boost up individual courage. And then in my chapters on collective courage, I talk actually about what you just said earlier. How do we bake courage into the very culture? So the example I use there is Netflix. It's a really interesting company, right? Netflix began as a DVD rental company. And their model to take on Blockbuster, which had 9,000 stores, was to build a whole network of warehouses with a really advanced inbound, outbound logistics algorithm. So the DVD, and then made all the customers create a queue of their favorite movies. So while you're watching number one, number two is sitting in the warehouse near your postal distribution center and is going to show up very soon after. So the transition time is solved. So that was the wave one. And then they destroy Blockbuster, and what do? Shut down all the distribution centers and go to streaming. As soon as they go to streaming, now the movie companies, the content owners say, I want to get paid not by DVD anymore, per viewing. Now their business model is at risk because the customer has an unlimited $9.99 a month subscription fee, and your supplier gets paid per view. So now you're going to go into content. And then from content, you say, well, I may as well go global. I can distribute my content globally. Then you say, no, but I got to have global content. So how does an organization, and by the way, your competition is no longer Blockbuster. Your competition now is Amazon, who doesn't need to make money on streaming. Your competition is Apple, that doesn't need to make money on streaming. Your competition is Disney, that has so much content and doesn't need to make money on streaming. How do you compete and win? That requires, guts baked into the very culture of the organization. How do you create the capacity for innovation, failure, learning? And so there's individual as there is collective courage that I think are really important.
If I recall correctly, the question was about if you can motivate courage through fear. That was
Yeah.
kind. And you know, Sea of PwC doesn't have so many fancy examples, so apologies for some of the boring auditor or PwC professional services type of examples. But my personal experience that if you create fear, it only creates compliance, maybe. It does not create courage. It may also create risk avoidance instead of risk management. So as a business, you want to create something, and so let me just bring you a business perspective. When people are able to manage the risks and not avoid the risk, because if people start to avoid the risk, it has a huge cost for you. This is not something you want to do, and this is not something you want to advise to your clients. So how can you create that? It's about creating a safe environment for failure, an environment for consultation, environment for cooperation that they also have immediately. There are, okay, I know that probably most of us heard this from bosses, professors, there is no stupid question, and then finally everybody feels like that this was a stupid question. So it's creating an environment where there's really no stupid question, creating an environment of trust, that people know that even if they don't manage risk rightly, there are people, systems, processes which provide some sort of safety net for when they simply screw up. And the third one is creating the necessary focus. I think people start to manage it, start to be afraid of having fear of something, making decision, when they don't have the right focus on a particular topic, or they don't have the right understanding, don't have the right experience with that, and don't have sufficient time to consult with others, and don't have those people around them who keep them up. So fear on its own doesn't help anything in my experience. It's just some sort of compliance with very, very high cost.
So there is a very interesting motivational framework that I go back to quite often. It's called RICE. Yeah, I don't know if you heard about it. So the letters stand for R for reward, I for ideology, C for coercion, and E for ego. And it makes more sense to use it as RICE as an acronym, but actually the biggest motivation comes from ideology. The second biggest motivation comes from ego. The third one from reward. And coercion, which we can say fear falls into that category, is the last in the order, but it is a sort of motivation. But ideology is by far the best motivational framework. And my question is, if we go through this list, can we just think of courage as is just a question of a motivational framework, or is it something more?
So, you know, as I was talking about courage to you, ideology, which I think you're absolutely right, first of all, that is very true, fits into the bucket which I call conviction. And you're right, if I was to pick one that has the most powerful oomph, it comes out of conviction. When we believe in something deeply. Ideology is one way to talk about it, identity is another way to talk about it, felt responsibility is another way to talk about it. This kind of this belief in something bigger than ourselves is a very animating thing for humankind. I think this kind of cost-benefit analysis is also a motivator. So there's cost-benefit, which is, you know, fear combined with rewards. You know, I'll reward you for taking risk. I'll punish you, you know, for not taking risk. So we look for some cost-benefit framework is one other extreme. I have a third bucket in here, which is where you provide people with the tools to deal with fear that is a necessary and essential product of doing something that involves courage. So how do I build up my confidence? How do I build up, you know, that self-efficacy, that I can do it? Or how do I build up that support, that I can do it? How do I deal with calm? So there are some, I would say, things that are neither cost benefits nor are they ideology, but there are other sets of skills that can help us act with courage or make it more likely. But I would go back to conviction, and I think conviction, ideology plays a huge role. Since you mentioned motivation, I'll just share with you. There's some fascinating research that was done by a professor at Michigan and another at Yale. They wanted to see how to get people to work harder. It's also known as unlocking discretionary effort. So for the longest time, for 70 odd years, the holy grail was job satisfaction. You pay people well, give them cost benefits, so rewards and punishments, and make it a safe work environment, give them tools and training, and they will work hard. And we've been measuring job sat for 70 years in the US. Then in the 80s, there was a Harvard Business School professor, Richard Hackman, who introduced the idea of engagement. And that's when Gallup ran crazy with the employee engagement scores. And the idea there was if people feel like they're part of a team, they feel empowered, they're in a positive, rewarding culture where they're learning and growing, and the work is interesting, they will be engaged and work even harder. Then came a third level, which has been called inspired work. And that's what these guys found in the last 10 years. When people feel meaning and identity out of their work, they will work even harder. Where they feel what I'm doing matters. Right? Whether it matters to society, to the planet, or even matters to customers, we're doing a startup that is going to transform this market. So when we experience that sense of meaning and identity, which you were calling ideology, it really energizes us. And the data on productivity is stunning. Inspired workers are 50% more productive than engaged workers, and twice as productive as satisfied workers. So I think you're absolutely right that ideology, meaning, identity, these things really matter. And organizations don't use them enough. They use reward systems as the only vehicle sometimes.
Yeah. Let me approach this question from how we make decisions, how we support our clients to make decisions or our colleagues. Because sometimes you don't have too much time for that, and I tend to feel that people believe there are too many complex decisions to be made. And we are here actually for our colleagues who we lead or for the clients we serve. How do you simplify those decisions and how to speed up the decision-making process? And how you kind of present, in a way, how you make them understand that maybe that decision they are wanting to make is not so complex. And how we are doing that. So first of all, I don't believe that there are super complex decisions when it comes to business world, because if you bring it down to first the culture of your firm, then to your internal values, and then you also bring in your strategy, which is probably wouldn't work anyhow without being somehow aligned with culture and your internal values, and you just filter the questions through these three layers, then it actually becomes quite obvious what is the right answer. Fears usually come into place that when you face the right answer, you don't have the courage to make the right decision. And that's usually the issue. And then you spend actually time not finding the right decision. You're actually spending the time about hesitating how to make a good decision, even if it doesn't sound good or your fear of the outcome. But actually the good decision is usually on the table.
You know, it's very interesting. You're absolutely spot on. And it reminded me of some research done at Harvard School of Education by two scholars. I don't know if you've published their book also. It's called Immunity to Change. It was published like 10, 15 years ago. And in that they call it the knowing-doing gap. And it was really at the individual level. Again, their book, like mine, is 2/3 of the book is the individual level, and then the last 1/3 is at the organization level. And the knowing-doing gap is you know what to do, you know how to do it, but you don't do it. So like You know, at the beginning of the year, what is the most common resolution people make around the world?
Lose weight.
Lose weight, exercise. Like me, every year I go on the internet, I say, what's the new science? And every year I learn the same thing. Exercise, don't eat too much, right? And have a regular routine. End of story. And yet, what do we do? So the question is, similarly, organizations also, and their point is that organizations and individuals, we develop these commitments. And our biggest challenge is to not having the courage to take them on, even of ourselves. We have our own commitments. So we say, well, we commit to doing things, but then we don't do them. And organizational commitments come in the flavor of culture. But individual commitments also come in the flavor of internal thinking that we have that, you know, like in my case, I'll give you an example. When I was trying to finish my PhD, I was struggling. It was like going on, and I couldn't focus, and I was lost. And then I was talking to one of my friends. He was also like me, lost and confused and struggling. And then, bang, 18 months later, he was done and out of it. So I said, like, what did you do? He said, I read Pavlov's research. I said, what do you mean? He said, Pavlovian reinforcement. I broke my day into 90-minute chunks. And every 90 minutes, if I felt I was productive, I gave myself a little Snickers bar. I love Snickers bars. And so all day long, I am giving myself 90-minute Snickers bar. I put on weight in those 18 months, but I finished my thesis. So now I have my own little internal reward system. I try to be very productive in my research every day. But I break my day into 90-minute chunks since I have a PhD. And if I'm productive in 90 minutes, I need a reward. I can't, otherwise my whole system breaks down. You know, I'm not going to work. I'm not going to get anything done. So, you know, we have these commitments that we believe in, and until we have the courage, so I would say the chapter I never wrote in the book, actually, which was supposed to be the last chapter, was the biggest courage we need to have is not to take on the world, is to take on ourselves. Our biggest barrier to growth, development, change, adaptation, learning, failing is ourself. And we have these commitments, we have these beliefs, we have these rigid worldviews and mindsets, and we don't want to take it on.
Yes, that form of motivation, the Snickers bar, raises another question, which is trade-offs. You know, how much belly fat are you willing to sacrifice for reaching a goal? But the knowing-doing gap that you just mentioned is actually, it's leading to the next question that I wanted to ask, but I just framed it differently. It's the problem of the willingness to act. And I'm going to get another World War story, this time from World War II. I was struggling to find examples that you didn't mention in the book, to be honest, to surprise you a bit, but this one was not in the book. It's about a person called Arnold Dues. He was a Dutch gardener, and he organized a network of resistance against the Nazis in the Netherlands during the Second World War. Now, this person, by the way, just the dance floor person you just mentioned in your presentation, had no history at all of being courage, brave, specific in any kind of noticeable way. But in his village, nearly every family was hiding Jews, and you could say that his courage was contagious because he was the first person to do it. Like his first act of courageousness was that a Nazi soldier came up to him and asked which way was Leiden, and he pointed the other direction. That was his, in his biography, I think, the first note that he thought of himself as being a resistant. And then he went on to everybody in the village, knocked on the doors, and tell them what's the right thing to do. And just like the lion in the example, probably everybody had this kind of courage in them. But how do you get to the point that you're willing to act on that courage?
You want to start?
Yeah, I wanted to dream when I could start. I can tell you an interesting story, and it's going to resonate. I'm not sure if most of the audience is Hungarian or international one. I think courage sometimes it can be super easy when it somehow arrives to your deepest disciplines, I guess. And then you feel really, when you feel really strong about something, then I guess it's really easy to act. And obviously this story is heartwarming, and what I'm not gonna just tell you is definitely not as heartwarming. But we at PwC, we always tend to be super careful who we work with. We call this risk of association. Brand of somebody else, brand of PwC next to each other. Do we like it or we don't like it? And it's sometimes not a very objective process. It's subjective. Our firm is owned by private individuals, so it's up to us. So we are definitely prior to the election a couple of years ago here in Hungary, I'm CEO of Hungary, and then we are approached by a client. And they desperately want us to become their auditors. And then we said, oh, and I said, okay, it doesn't look like, I don't want to see this brand next to our brand. So this is a very important Hungarian person, so we are asked to visit their office 7 in the morning, which is quite unusual for business discussions. So we arrive 7 in the morning. We sit down with top management, then my colleague trying to do this kind of Chewbacca technique. I'm not sure if you understand, starting to talk about something completely different topic, if we may avoid the real question. So the way is starting 7 o'clock in the morning in 1848, when we had a revolution in Hungary against the Habsburgs. That was the year when PwC was founded, and I was like, oh gosh, what's going to happen here? And then, but the Chewbacca techniques unfortunately didn't work, so we arrived to the question of, okay, if we're going to become the auditors or not. And then I said, okay, actually we can give a long story or a short story, but let me give you the short story because you've already heard a little bit about Hungarian Revolution, so I'm not going to repeat that. It's never going to happen. And then complete silence and freeze. And then the CEO goes out, calls the shareholder, comes back to me, and she said, you need to change your mind because this is going to have consequences. And I said, and he is not very happy. And you know, it was like, it really had consequences, by the way. But, so he was not lying at all. But the main story was here that I told them that, look, this is not about us making anybody happy. This is about us. PwC, we value our independence, and we're never gonna work together with anybody who would impair that independence, because that would harm our brand. And we're never gonna put our brand next to anybody else's brand, which would make us look impairing our own independence. So, and that was not an easy moment. We are talking about a very influential person in Hungary. We lost a lot of money around that, but this is how we build sustainable business in that, and this was quite an easy decision at the end, because it just went back to some of our core values, and it was really easy to answer a difficult question in a difficult situation. So,
I think that's a great example. I mean, that's a great example, and where you have to find in yourself kind of what are your core beliefs and what are your core foundational principles. To me, that actually reminds me, my previous book before this was called Deep Purpose. And I called it Deep Purpose, not Purpose, because I said if you really want to benefit from having a purpose, you have to go deep with it. And if I look at when you're clear about your purpose, about your values, about your mission, then courage is actually quite easy. It's not that hard. That's why your point earlier, you called it ideology, you called it values, I called it purpose. These are kind of core belief systems that create a North Star for us as to what is my orienting framework. And so in my mind, I think your earlier question is spot on. That if I look at the younger people here in this room, you know, when you have a set of kind of convictions about what you believe, it becomes easier to navigate and make choices and trade-offs. I think, you know, I was at tenterhooks just listening to your story, that how would you take that on? But, you know, the way you heard him describe it, he said it wasn't that hard. And he said, there's no way it's going to happen. This is not like a negotiation. There's no way. It's not negotiable. Now, it's easier said than done, especially when there are consequences, sometimes physical consequences and financial consequences, right? And but then learning to kind of work through that. And you know, you made a question that I never answered earlier, that in some ways, I'm guilty of one thing in this book. There's survivor bias. There's a lot of happy stories about courage in there. There are some that are not happy, that don't end well. Alexei Navalny is one of them that doesn't end well. Frances Haugen is another one that doesn't end well. I also looked at some Ukrainian commandos whose story doesn't end well. I looked at Japanese samurai kamikaze pilots, you know, who had to go into suicide missions that doesn't end well. But nonetheless, yes, I would grant you that there's survivor bias in some of these reportings. But there's something we can learn from survivors too, that I think is important. But I think these are the stories where you realize that courage has consequences. It's not always positive, right? It comes at a price. And are you willing to pay that price?
Yes, so you quoted Churchill earlier. We can quote him again. You know, when he asked, do you have enemies? And if you say yes, he said, good. It means you stood up for something in your life. We talked about World War I, World War II examples, and I think we are approaching to the end of our discussion. So for each of you, what are your favorite examples of courage, either from your personal life or from stories, from the book or history? Like, what would you name are the ones that you can really relate to? Please don't say the compliance example again.
Not another compliance example. So, for example, for me, when it's not just about being spontaneous bravery, but about being courageous, knowing exactly that there's gonna be a hard price to be paid. So, for example, if you're looking at Navalny, what happened to him? It's highly likely that he knew what's going to happen to him when he returns to Russia. So it was not like, okay, I decide to jump down here and let's see what's going to happen. You know, he already been poisoned, he survived that, and then still decided to return to Russia. So that, for me, this is like, how can somebody be so brave and courageous and show example and take such a sacrifice, and not in a spontaneous way. So that's, for me, that was like incredible.
Yeah, and I think, but this goes back to your earlier point. When we have conviction and belief in something bigger than ourselves, you know, you will go to the nth degree for it. We can do life and death, and I have one of those for you, but I must tell you that, to me, one of the most interesting one was a sports coach. This is an American football coach. His name is Pete Carroll. And I was trying to write a case about him and his technique to motivate his team. And he said, well, if you want to understand me, you got to first look at the other extreme coach. And I said, who's that? He said, the coach in Boston. So the coach in Boston was a guy called Bill Belichick. And Bill Belichick's team mantra, the culture, the principles, was do your job. He was a very top-down, directive, accountability, rewards and punishment. I'll shoot you if you don't do your job. Right? It was a fear-based model, and it works. He's won a lot of championships. Right? And some players chose to play for him. They wanted that. Pete's model was, his team mantra was, I'm in. I'm in. Not you're in, I'm in. And it was a model where he was trying to get them to understand that we are all in it together. That you're not just playing for yourself and your job. Do your job, and if you don't do your job, I fire you. You're not playing. You're playing for each other. We're playing for the team. We're playing for our teammates. We're playing for our fans. And I talked to the players, and I talked to some players who played for both the coaches. And they said, I can't explain to you, when I play for Pete, I'm a different person. I was a different person. I showed up differently. I'm in. And I think to me, and by the way, American football is a very transactional business. They buy and sell players like commodities. But somehow this guy created this kind of context. And what I've come to realize is leaders are context architects. They create a context within which people choose to work. The labor market is very efficient. People choose the context which they believe will bring out the best in them. And so some leaders create a fear-based, directive, what I would call even risk-averse environment, where it's top-down directive. The only person who's able to take risk and innovate and experiment is sitting up on top. Others are trying to build a more inclusive environment where they want to tap into everybody, where everybody shows up differently. And to me, that was really the unlock, and how, this is an age-old debate in social sciences. Are human beings individuals, or are we social creatures? We're both. We are driven by our internal impulses, but we are also heavily influenced by the context in which we choose to operate. And so I thought that, to me, so this sports coach I learned a lot from.
I was just thinking if I should end the conversation with a personal story, if you don't mind, just to share something where I drew my courage from, and which one is my favorite example, because this one is from the family. So my grandfather was in a working camp in the Second World War, and at one night they took them out, probably by 15 or 20 batches, and they made them dug their own grave. Of course, they didn't know they were digging their own grave. They just lined them up at the hole when they finished. And they started shooting them in the grave. So my grandfather instinctively, he fell in the grave before the bullets reached him. And he was lying there for probably a day. And he had to witness every group that was shot in that grave. And he had to make sure that he was not seen as being alive, but making sure that no bodies fell on him or he was not obstructed. And after one day, the shooting was over after a couple of hours, but after one day he heard steps. And a German soldier came to the hole and asked, if there is anybody still alive, I'm willing to help. And he said after a minute of hesitation, he raised his hand and he said he's alive. So that leap of faith, that courage that he had that time was one personal source of courage for me, that he was willing to take a bet on trust. So maybe it will go into your next book.
What a great story.
Yeah.
I mean, wow.
And
both of the stories I've heard from both of you were really stunning.
So thank you very much. We are really happy to have you here, and I think everybody is eager to get your signature on their copies, so I'll leave our audience to have you, and thank you very much to both of you for the conversation.
Thank you.